The year 1945 is remembered as the moment when the deadliest conflict in human history came to an end. World War II had consumed nations, destroyed cities, and taken tens of millions of lives. By the time the guns fell silent, the world was transformed forever. What followed in the months and years after 1945 was not simply a return to peace, but the construction of a new global order. Borders shifted, empires collapsed, and new powers rose to dominance. Every aspect of our modern world, from politics to technology, from international institutions to everyday life, carries the imprint of that transformative year. Understanding what happened in the aftermath of 1945 is essential if we want to understand how the present world came to be. The first impact of 1945 was the immense human cost of the war. Tens of millions were dead, cities from Warsaw to Tokyo lay in ruins, and entire populations were displaced. In Europe alone, there were millions of refugees, wandering across a continent shattered by bombings and invasions. In Asia, the devastation from the war with Japan and the use of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki left deep scars. This level of destruction created a sense of urgency among world leaders. They knew that the world could not afford to repeat the mistakes that had led to such a catastrophic war. This realization set the stage for the political and social changes that would reshape the globe. One of the most immediate consequences of 1945 was the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as the two dominant superpowers. Before the war, global power was spread among European empires such as Britain, France, and Germany. But the war had weakened Europe economically and militarily, leaving space for the US and USSR to fill the vacuum. The United States emerged with its industrial base intact and stronger than ever. The Soviet Union, despite suffering enormous losses, had expanded its territory and demonstrated its military might. The rivalry between these two nations set the stage for the Cold War, a geopolitical struggle that would define international relations for the next half-century. At the same time, 1945 marked the beginning of the end for colonial empires. Nations across Asia and Africa had been drawn into the war effort, and many had fought for their colonial masters with promises of freedom afterward. Once the war ended, those promises could not be ignored. India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and many others began their struggles for independence. Within a few decades, much of the colonial map had been erased. The world after 1945 was no longer dominated by empires, but by newly independent nations seeking their place in the global order. This wave of decolonization reshaped demographics, economies, and cultural identities across the planet. Another defining feature of the post-1945 world was the establishment of international institutions designed to prevent future conflicts. The League of Nations had failed to stop World War II, but world leaders were determined to try again. Out of this determination came the United Nations, founded in 1945 with the goal of fostering cooperation, peace, and human rights. Alongside the UN, other institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created to stabilize economies and rebuild war-torn nations. These organizations still play central roles in global affairs today, and their origins lie in the ashes of 1945. Economically, the post-war years were both challenging and transformative. Europe faced immense rebuilding tasks, and in response, the United States launched the Marshall Plan in 1947, pouring billions of dollars into European economies. This aid not only helped rebuild infrastructure, but also tied Western Europe closely to the United States, reinforcing the divide with the Soviet-controlled East. Meanwhile, Japan, devastated by the war, underwent an American-led occupation that restructured its government and economy. Within a few decades, Japan transformed into an economic powerhouse, showing how post-war reconstruction could lead to rapid modernization. The legacy of 1945 also lives in the realm of science and technology. The war had accelerated advancements in fields such as radar, medicine, and most dramatically, nuclear technology. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki introduced the world to the terrifying power of nuclear weapons, ushering in an age of both fear and deterrence. The nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union became one of the defining aspects of the Cold War, and the threat of nuclear conflict still shapes international relations today. At the same time, the technological momentum of the war fed into peacetime innovations, fueling the rise of computers, jet travel, and modern medicine. Socially and culturally, the world of 1945 was one of profound change. The horrors of the Holocaust were revealed in full as Allied forces liberated concentration camps. The genocide of 6 million Jews, along with millions of other victims, shocked the conscience of the world. In response, human rights became a central concern of the new global order. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, was a direct response to the atrocities of the war. It established principles that still underpin international law and human rights movements today. In the United States, the end of the war brought a period of economic prosperity known as the post-war boom. Soldiers returned home, families grew, and suburban life flourished, but it also laid the groundwork for social struggles. African American soldiers who had fought for freedom abroad returned to a segregated homeland, fueling the civil rights movement. Women, who had entered the workforce in large numbers during the war, began demanding more equality in the years that followed. Thus, 1945 not only reshaped global politics, but also ignited social transformations that continue to influence societies today. Another lasting effect of 1945 was the division of Germany and the reshaping of Europe. The Allies divided Germany into zones of occupation, which soon hardened into the division between West Germany and East Germany. Berlin, the capital, became the symbolic center of the Cold War, split between democratic West and communist East. The Iron Curtain that fell across Europe was one of the clearest outcomes of the post-war settlement. It demonstrated how the victory of 1945 gave way almost immediately to a new conflict, this time fought not on battlefields, but through ideology, diplomacy, and proxy wars. The Pacific region, too, was transformed. Japan's defeat ended its empire. The Cold War, decolonization struggles, civil rights movements, and the nuclear standoff all traced their roots back to the world that emerged after World War II. As we look at today's global challenges, whether geopolitical tensions, debates over human rights, or the role of international institutions, it is impossible to ignore the shadow of 1945. The institutions founded then remain central, the conflicts born then continue to echo, and the lessons of that time remain vital. The year 1945 was not simply an ending. It was a beginning, a moment when the old world was destroyed and a new one was built, one whose structure still frames the challenges and possibilities of the 21st century. So when we ask how our modern world came to be, the answer is clear. It is shaped by 1945, by the choices made in the aftermath of war, by the hopes for peace, and by the struggles that followed. The world after World War II is our world, and its story is still unfolding today.